The envelope had no return address, no stamp, no fingerprints a lab could lift, just a single sheet of paper folded around a child's drawing. Crayon flames eating a crayon house, a stick figure man with a gold ring on his hand, and beneath it, in a 7-year-old's clumsy print, 3 words that turned a grown man's blood to ice. I saw you. Gabriel Calabro set the drawing down on his desk with the same careful hands he used for everything else in his life. Controlled, deliberate, betraying nothing. 22 floors below him, New Orleans glittered along the river like something innocent. He did not feel innocent. He had not felt innocent in a very long time. "Where did this come from?" he asked, not looking up. "Dropped at the front desk," said the man standing across from him. No camera caught a face. Whoever left it knew exactly where the blind spots were. Gabriel's uncle, Vincent Calabro, leaned against the windowsill with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life believed the floor could open beneath him. He was 61, silver at the temples, and he wore his family's signet ring the way some men wore wedding bands, like a vow he'd made himself a long time ago and never once doubted. "Burn it," Vincent said. "Whatever this is, whoever sent it, you don't chase ghosts, Gabriel. You bury them. This isn't a ghost. This is a person. Somebody who was there." Gabriel turned the drawing over, looking for anything. A watermark, a smudge, a name. There was nothing. Only the date scrawled faintly in pencil at the bottom corner. A date that made his stomach drop straight through the floor. It was the date of fire at Maison Delacroix. 22 years ago this November. The night that had ended one family and quietly built the foundation of another. "You weren't even there," Vincent said, too quickly. "You were a boy." "I was 12, Gabriel said. "I remember more than you think." For just a moment, something moved behind his uncle's eyes, small, fast, gone before Gabriel could be sure he hadn't imagined it. Then Vincent straightened his jacket and said, in the voice of a man closing a door, "Let it go. Whoever sent that letter wants you scared and chasing your tail. Don't give them the satisfaction." But Gabriel did not let it go. He had spent 5 years since his father's death trying to drag the family name out of the dark. Legitimate shipping contracts, a foundation in his mother's name, dinners with senators who needed to be able to look him in the eye. He had built something clean out of something filthy, brick by brick, and he was not about to let an anonymous threat knock it down. He needed to know who had sent it. He needed to know if they were still alive to send another. 200 miles northwest, in a town so small it didn't have a stoplight, only a blinking yellow caution. Elena Marsh stood in front of 22 third graders and tried very hard not to flinch when a truck backfired outside. It happened in less than a second. The sound, sharp, percussive, wrong, and her whole body went cold and far away, the way it always did, the classroom blurring at the edges while some older, smaller partner crouched in the dark and waited for footsteps. She gripped the edge of her desk until it bit into her palm and breathed and came back. Miss Marsh. A little girl named Daisy was watching her with the unguarded concern only children have left for adults. "You okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." Elena smiled, and it was a good smile, practiced, the kind that had gotten her through 29 years of pretending the ground was solid. Just thinking about lunch. Who's ready for fractions? The class groaned in unison, and the moment passed the way it always did. Elena Marsh, curvy, warm-eyed, beloved by every parent in St. Solange of the patience she had with the slow readers and the bullied kids and the ones nobody else wanted in their classroom, had built an entire life out of moments passing. She had a modest house with a porch swing that needed oiling, a closet full of cardigans, and exactly one person in town who knew there was something underneath all that warmth that didn't quite belong to her. That person was Deputy Marcus Hale, who had grown up 2 streets over from her adoptive mother's house and had loved Elena, quietly and uselessly, since they were 16. He stopped by most evenings under the excuse of checking the porch light she always forgot to fix, and most evenings she let him, because his steadiness asked nothing of her, and asking nothing was the only kind of love she knew how to receive. "You look pale today," he said that evening, leaning on her porch rail, while she swept leaves that didn't need sweeping. "Sheriff said there was a backfire on Magnolia. You hear it." "I'm fine, Marcus." "You always say that." "It's always true." She didn't look at him. She had learned a long time ago that looking at people who loved you made it harder to lie to them. What Marcus didn't know, what no one in St. Solange knew, was that 1 year ago, on the anniversary of her adoptive mother's death, Elena had finally opened the locked cedar box Margaret Marsh had left specifically for her, with strict instructions not to open it until she was ready. Inside had been a letter, brittle with age, and a phrase that had cracked Elena's careful, ordinary life straight down the middle. Your name was not always Elena. I promised Sister Agnes I would keep that name buried with me, but I am dying, and some debts don't belong in the ground. You were born, Sophia. I will not write the rest. If you ever need it, look for what happened to the Marchetti family. Elena had not looked. For years she had told herself she didn't need to know, that whatever waited behind that name was a door better left shut. But some nights when the house was dark and quiet, she still saw it. The thing she had never told a living soul, not even Margaret. A dining room full of broken glass and red light. A man's hand on a gun, gold catching the firelight. A voice, rough and final, saying something she had never let herself remember in full. She had been very good, for 22 years, at not remembering. She was about to lose that ability completely. 3 weeks after the drawing arrived, Gabriel Calabro found himself sitting in a small parish records office 200 miles from home, listening to an elderly clerk explain that the particular shade of red crayon and the type of cardstock matched an art supply donation made 11 years ago to exactly 4 elementary schools in the state, 3 of which had since closed. That leaves Live Oak Elementary, the clerk said, St. Solange. It wasn't proof of anything. A drawing could change hands 100 ways. But it was the first real thread Gabriel had found in 3 weeks of digging, and he followed threads a way his father never had. Patiently, quietly, without leaving bodies behind him, he told his assistant to look into education grants. Within a week, the Calabro Family Foundation had a meeting scheduled with the superintendent of St. Solange Parish Schools, and Gabriel had a reason to walk to the front doors of Live Oak Elementary, wearing a donor smile, and carrying a check made out for more than the school's entire annual budget. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He told himself a great many things in those weeks that turned out not to be entirely true. He saw her before she saw him, through the wire mesh window of a classroom door, sitting cross-legged on the floor in a circle of 7-year-olds, reading aloud in a voice that made even Gabriel, hardened as he was, feel something loosen in his chest. She had dark hair pulled back loose enough that pieces had escaped around her face, and she laughed at something a child said, head tipping back. Completely unguarded in a way Gabriel hadn't been in front of another human being since he was younger than the kids in that room. When she finally looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her whole posture changed. Not fear exactly, but kind of bracing, a door quietly closing somewhere behind her eyes. It was the look of someone who had learned, the hard way, that strangers in doorways were rarely good news. "Can I help you?" she asked, rising, smoothing her skirt. "Gabriel Calabro," he said, extending a hand he hoped didn't betray how carefully he'd rehearsed this. "I believe I have a meeting with your principal about the foundation grant. I got a little lost." Something in her face eased, just slightly. "Everyone gets lost in this building. I'm Elena Marsh." He shook her hand, and for one disorienting half-second, he forgot every reason he had come to this town. That night, driving back toward New Orleans, Gabriel pulled over on the shoulder of a dark county road and sat with his hands on the wheel for a long time, not moving. He told himself the unsettled feeling in his chest was caution, professional instinct, the part of him trained since childhood to be wary of anything that felt too easy. But underneath the caution was something else entirely, something he hadn't let himself feel in years, and it frightened him far more than the drawing on his desk ever had. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not part of any plan Gabriel had made, and that frightened him more than any threatening letter ever could. He told himself the visits to St. Solange were about the foundation, about due diligence, about making sure the grant money built a new library wing instead of disappearing into some bureaucrat's pocket. He came on a Tuesday to see the construction site and somehow ended up eating dinner at a diner with red vinyl booths, listening to Elena Marsh talk about the 8-year-old in her class who taught himself to read by sounding out cereal boxes, and laughing, actually laughing, an unguarded sound he didn't recognize coming out of his own chest. "You don't seem like a man who spends a lot of time in towns like this," Elena said, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't really want, just to have something to do with her hands. What kind of man do I seem like? The kind whose suits cost more than my car. She smiled to soften it. I mean it as a compliment to your tailor, not an insult to you. My tailor will be relieved. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, an old habit, a tell he didn't know he had. I grew up in a world that required a great deal of polish. Sometimes I think I came here because nobody in St. Solange needs anything from me except a working roof and decent textbooks. That's restful in its way. It was, he realized as he said it, the most honest sentence he'd spoken aloud in years. Elena studied him a moment too long. Everybody needs something from somebody, Mr. Calabro. The lucky ones just don't know what they need yet. And the unlucky ones spend their whole lives pretending they don't need anything at all. She said it lightly, like a joke, but her eyes didn't match her tone, and Gabriel found himself wondering, not for the first time that evening, what exactly had taught a woman this kind to be this careful. You sound like you're speaking from experience. I'm a third-grade teacher in a town with one stoplight. I don't have experience. I have a porch swing that needs oiling and a closet full of cardigans. She smiled, and this time it almost reached her eyes. Tell me something true, Mr. Calabro. Why does a man like you actually want a library in a town like this? He thought about lying. He was good at it. He'd had practice his whole life. Instead, he said, because nobody here has ever once asked me what I want in return for it. I find that I like the feeling. He didn't have an answer for what came after that. He drove the 2 hours back to New Orleans that night with the windows down despite the cold, trying to remember the last time a woman had said something that lodged itself behind his ribs and stayed there. The visits kept happening. He helped her replace a sagging gutter on the school's east wing on a Saturday he should have spent in board meetings. Came back the following week with his sleeves rolled up to help paint the new library shelves a soft sage green she'd picked out, and somewhere in the sawdust and the paint fumes and the radio playing low from someone's truck, he stopped pretending to himself that this was reconnaissance. He had not told her his last name carried weight in certain rooms. He had not told her about the drawing or the letter or the slow, gnawing fear that had brought him to her town in the first place. He told himself he would, eventually when it mattered. He did not yet understand that it already did. Back in New Orleans, Vincent Calabro was growing impatient in a particular way of men who have spent decades accustomed to being obeyed. He's spending half his week in some swamp town, he told Camille DeLuca, over drinks at a private club that smelled of cigars and old money. Camille was the daughter of an old family ally, beautiful in the polished, expensive way of someone raised to be seen, and she'd been quietly groomed since childhood to become Gabriel's wife, an arrangement everyone in their circle treated as settled fact, except, apparently, Gabriel. Some teacher, Camille said, and there was an edge under the word that she didn't quite manage to hide. He mentioned her exactly once. I had to find out the rest from his driver. Find out everything, Vincent said. Where she's from, who her people are, what she knows. Camille looked at him sideways. What she knows about what? Vincent smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. About nothing, sweetheart. Just be thorough. Camille didn't ask again. She told herself she was simply protecting what was hers, gathering information the way any sensible woman would before a rival made a fool of her in front of the entire family. She did not yet understand what kind of fire she was being asked to play with. Only that jealousy makes excellent kindling, and someone else was already holding the match. It was Elena who broke first, not Gabriel, though it was Gabriel's own carelessness that lit the fuse. She found the newspaper clipping by accident. While researching her own family history in the parish library on a slow Sunday afternoon, finally, letting herself follow the thread her adoptive mother had left her a year before. Marchetti family slain in French Quarter fire. The headline read, 22 years old and yellowed at the edges. 6 dead. Cause undetermined. Survivors unknown. Her hands had gone numb holding the page. She had read it 4 times before she let herself absorb the smaller article beside it, the one that mentioned, almost as an aside, that authorities had questioned but never charged a rival business family, the Calabros, regarding the deaths. She sat very still in the library for a long time after that, the way she had learned to sit still as a child, the way that made the bad feeling pass over her like weather instead of swallowing her whole. Calabro, the same name on the foundation check pinned to the school bulletin board. The same name belonging to the man whose laugh had started to feel like something she could build a life around. She told herself it was a coincidence. Calabros were not an uncommon family, and New Orleans was full of old names tangled up in old rumors that meant nothing by the time they reached a small town 2 hours away. She told herself this twice, then 3 times, then stopped believing it the 3rd time through. That night, lying awake, she let herself remember, really remember, for the first time in 22 years, the gold ring on a hand that had held the gun, the way the firelight had caught the metal, and a detail she had never told anyone, not Margaret, not Marcus, not the box of letters, a small chip in gold near the signet, like the ring had been dropped once and never properly repaired. The next time Gabriel came to St. Solange, she didn't open the door. He stood on her porch for 10 minutes, knocking, calling her name with a gentleness that made the refusal harder, not easier. Finally, he gave up and left a note tucked into the screen door. Whatever I did, I'd like the chance to fix it, and drove back to New Orleans not understanding that the thing he'd done was simply exist, simply be born with the wrong last name into the wrong inheritance. Elena avoided him for 9 days. On the 10th, he showed up at the school during recess, in front of God and 22 children, and a teacher's aide who had gossiped about it for a month, and said, "I'm not leaving until you tell me what changed." "Your name," she said, low, shaking. "Calabro. 22 years ago, a family called Marchetti died in a fire in New Orleans. Your family was questioned about it. Did you know that?" Something in Gabriel's face went very still, very careful. The face of a man recalculating an entire structure in real time. "I know about the fire," he said slowly. "I was a child when it happened. I don't know everything about it. I've spent the last month trying to find out more, actually, because of..." He stopped himself. Because of what? He could have told her then. Some nights later, he would lie awake and replay that exact moment, the fork in the road he hadn't taken. Instead, afraid of what the truth would do to the fragile, impossible thing growing between them. He said only, because the past doesn't always stay buried. "I didn't come here to hurt you. Elena, I swear that to you." "You don't even know what hurting me would mean," she said, and walked back inside, leaving him standing alone on the blacktop, while children's laughter rang strangely cheerful all around him. That night, for the first time in 22 years, Elena let herself say the name out loud, alone in her kitchen, testing the shape of it in her mouth like a key in an old lock. "Sophia Marchetti," she whispered. The kitchen light flickered, or maybe it was just her eyes. The break between them lasted 11 days, and in that time, 2 separate betrayals, neither one cruel in its origin, both of them devastating in their consequence, began quietly closing in on her like weather she couldn't see coming. The first came from Marcus Hale, who had a gambling debt he'd never told a living soul about, run up 2 years prior in a card game he should have walked away from, owed to men who answered, several layers removed, to Vincent Calabro. When a soft-spoken stranger calling himself an insurance adjuster started asking around St. Solange about a woman matching this description, possible connection to a New Orleans family, Marcus's debt was quietly, pointedly mentioned, and Marcus, terrified, cornered, telling himself he was confirming nothing dangerous, said yes, there was a teacher in town who fit that description. Elena Marsh lived on Cypress Lane. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a great many things, the way frightened people do. The second betrayal came from Camille, who learned that same week that Gabriel had quietly ended the long-assumed engagement his family had built around her, had told his mother plainly that he would not be marrying a woman he'd never chosen. And Camille, hurt in the specific, humiliated way of someone watching her whole future dissolve in another woman's favor, called Vincent in tears and said the only true thing she had, that the teacher's name was Elena Marsh, that she lived in St. Solange, that Gabriel had thrown away everything for her. Camille didn't know what Vincent would do with that information. She told herself, afterward, that she'd only wanted someone to be as angry as she was. She would carry that lie about herself for a long time. Vincent Calabro now had a name and a town. He had been waiting patiently for exactly this. What Vincent had not told anyone, not Camille, not his nephew, not a living soul in 22 years, was a truth buried inside the fire at Maison Delacroix. It had not been Antonio's order. Antonio had wanted peace with the Marchettis, had in fact gone to that dinner to broker exactly that, a division of the docks that would have let both families prosper without blood. It was Vincent, jealous of a younger brother who'd inherited their father's loyalty along with his empire, who had arranged for the gunman, who had stood in that smoke-filled dining room with his ring catching the firelight, and ended 6 lives to end a rivalry his brother refused to start. Antonio had found out within the week. And Antonio, weak with grief and terrified of what a war between brothers would do to everything their father had built, had taken the blame onto his own back rather than tear the family apart from the inside, had told a few who needed telling that it was his order, his mess, his to carry, and had carried it silently into an early grave 5 years ago, leaving his son to inherit guilt that had never actually belonged to him. Gabriel did not know any of this yet. He was about to learn all of it within the same terrible week that Elena's life came apart at the seams. It happened on a Thursday. Gabriel had driven to St. Solange uninvited, unable to stay away any longer, and found Elena's porch light shattered, the screen door standing open and on her kitchen table, placed there with deliberate, theatrical cruelty, the same child's drawing he'd received weeks earlier, the original this time, the burning house, the gold ring, I saw you, except now beneath it someone had added, in adult handwriting. She did too. Time to finish what should have ended 22 years ago. Elena was gone. Gabriel stood in that kitchen and felt something inside him break open that had been sealed shut since he was 12 years old. The memory came all at once, unstoppable. A door kicked off its hinges. A dining room full of smoke and screaming. His father's hand gripping his shoulder, dragging him toward an exit. A small girl, 7 years old, hiding beneath an overturned table, eyes huge and silent in the firelight. Gabriel, 12, terrified, and somehow steadier in that one moment than he had ever been before since, pulling her free, shoving her toward the kitchen's back door, whispering, "Run. Don't stop. Don't ever tell anyone your name," while behind him, in the orange light, a hand raised a gun, and on that hand, a gold signet ring with a small chip near the setting, dropped once and never properly repaired. He had spent 22 years not remembering his uncle's face in that room, because some merciful, terrified part of his 12-year-old brain had simply refused to let him. He knew now, with the sick clarity of a man finally seeing his whole life laid out straight, exactly who had sent the drawing, exactly who had been sending every threat, exactly who had Elena, and exactly why. He called Marcus Hale directly. His investigator had found the deputy's name attached to recent calls from a Calabro link number within the hour, and Marcus, hearing the rage and terror in a stranger's voice, finally understood what his silence had cost, and told Gabriel everything, including the one detail that mattered most. Vincent kept a private property outside the city for situations he didn't want connected to his name, an old, half-collapsed building on the river, Maison Delacroix, closed for 2 decades, never sold, never demolished. Vincent had kept it standing. Gabriel realized with a fresh wave of nausea, the way some men keep a scar, to remember exactly how much they were capable of. Marcus drove there himself, badge and gun, and a debt he meant to finally repay, and arrive 11 minutes before Gabriel did, finding 2 of Vincent's men at the gate and going through them with the kind of desperate, reckless courage that gets good men hurt. He was bleeding from a graze along his ribs by the time Gabriel's car skidded to a stop in the gravel drive. But he was alive, and it bought just enough time. Inside the ruined dining room, the same room, Gabriel realized with his pulse roaring his ears. The exact same room, Elena sat bound to a chair, chin lifted, refusing to give Vincent the satisfaction of her fear, even as her whole body shook with it. "You don't have to do this," she was saying, voice raw. "Whatever happened back then, I don't even remember your face. I was 7. You remember the ring," Vincent said, almost gently, almost regretful, and that was somehow worse than rage would have been. "You always remember the ring." "Vincent." Gabriel's voice cut across the room, steady in a way he didn't feel. "Let her go." His uncle turned, and for one strange, suspended moment, looked almost relieved to finally be seen for exactly what he was. "You remember now, too, don't you? I can see it on your face. 12 years old, and you still managed to get her out from under my nose. I always wondered why I never found that little girl's body. You let my father carry this. For 22 years. He died still believing it was a sin to bear. Your father was weak, Vincent said, and for the first time, something genuinely ugly surfaced in his voice. He would have given away everything our father built to make peace with the Marchettis. I saved this family. I built the empire you spent 5 years dismantling with your charity dinners and your foundation grants and your soft little schoolteacher. I am not going to lose everything now because a child grew up and learned to draw. It's over, Vincent. Gabriel stepped further into ruined room, slow, careful, his eyes never leaving the gun his uncle had raised, the same hand. He realized with a fresh chill, the same ring, the chip and the gold still there after all these years, a wound that had simply never healed, on a man who had never let it. Marcus Hale is alive outside, and he's already called this in. There are people on their way who will hear every word you just said to me. There's no version of tonight where you walk away from this clean. Then I'll walk away dirty, Vincent said, and turned the gun toward Elena. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, though Gabriel would relive it for the rest of his life at something closer to 4 hours. He moved, the way he had moved at 12 years old without thinking, threw himself between the gun and the woman he loved, and felt the impact tear through his shoulder a half-second before he heard the sound of sirens finally cresting the gravel road. Vincent did not get a second shot. 2 deputies, summoned by Marcus's call 20 minutes earlier, took him down in the doorway before he could decide whether to run or finish what he'd started, and the man who had spent 22 years building an empire on a secret found himself, in the end, undone by the same kind of small, cheap fear that had started it all. Elena got the ropes off her own wrists with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and crawled across that broken floor to where Gabriel lay bleeding into the boards of the very room where, 2 decades earlier, he had once saved her life without anyone ever knowing his name. "Stay with me," she said, pressing her cardigan hard against his shoulder, her voice breaking apart. "Stay with me. Do you hear me? I am not doing this. I am not losing anyone else in this room." "Sophia," Gabriel said, and it was the first time anyone had called her that since she was 7 years old, and something in her chest that had been clenched shut for 22 years finally let go. "I'm the one who pulled you out. That night, I didn't even know if you'd lived." "I lived," she said, crying now, holding his face in both hands. "I lived because of you. Don't you dare let go now." He didn't. 3 weeks later, Gabriel sat in a hospital chair he'd practically taken up residence in, his arm in a sling, listening to Elena read aloud to a room full of get-well cards from 23rd graders who had apparently decided, en masse, that their teacher's new friend needed cheering up. He found himself laughing, really laughing, the unguarded kind, at a card that simply read, "Get better, Mar. Calabro, your arm looks cool," signed by a boy named Tyler with 3 exclamation points. Vincent Calabro was in federal custody, facing charges that stretched back decades. The truth of Maison Delacroix finally entered into a record that had sat blank and unsolved for 22 years. Gabriel had handed over every ledger, every account, every shadow corner of the family business his uncle had built in secret, and watched 5 years of careful legitimacy finally become something whole and unhaunted instead of merely respectable on paper. Camille had written Elena a letter that arrived and signed it first, then signed, then finally followed by a phone call, an apology offered with real shame in it, accepted with particular grace of a woman who understood exactly how loneliness could curdle into something dangerous, and who chose, deliberately, not to let it harden her against forgiving someone else for the same mistake. Marcus Hale had resigned in the sheriff's department the week after, not out of disgrace, but out of need to settle his own debts properly in daylight, and had quietly started paying back every dollar, to the bank and to Elena, in the slower currency of simply showing up honestly, asking nothing in return, the kind of love that had been waiting all along to become friendship instead. "I should have told you the second they came asking," he said to her one afternoon, sitting on the porch steps he'd repaired for her, without being asked, screwdriver still in hand. "I told myself I was protecting you by saying nothing. I was protecting myself." "You almost died trying to fix it," Elena said. "I think that counts for something, Marcus." "It counts for something. It doesn't undo what almost happened." He looked down at his hands. "I just need you to know I see the difference." She reached over and squeezed his shoulder, and it was, for the first time in 13 years, an entirely uncomplicated gesture. No guilt in it, no longing, just gratitude, plain and clean. And Elena, Sophia Marchetti, a name she had finally let herself reclaim. Spoken out loud at her parents' grave for the first time in 22 years, standing beside a man who had once been a frightened 12-year-old boy in a burning room, found that the fear she had carried for so long had not vanished exactly. It had simply stopped being the loudest thing inside her. "I keep thinking," she said one evening, sitting beside Gabriel's hospital bed with her feet tucked under her, "about how strange it is. The worst night of my life, and the best thing that happened in the very same room. I used to think that room only held one kind of memory," Gabriel said, taking her hand carefully with his good arm. "I'm glad it turned out to hold two." Outside the window, the lights of New Orleans glittered along the river the way they always had, indifferent and beautiful. And for the first time in either their lives, neither one of them needed a brace for whatever the dark might still be hiding. The past had finally finished saying everything it needed to say. What came next belonged only to them.